and say, look, we have a responsibility. It's codified now in Article 61, and Article 61 gets referred to again and again when other humanitarian disasters start to emerge in the later periods. I'd also like to note that another solution that comes out of this story, this question about helping oppressed minorities, is the national solution. And Berlin codifies this notion of oppression being eliminated through legal protections, but it also whacks off Bulgaria and says it doesn't belong to Turkey anymore. You can't administer this anymore, so now Bulgaria is going to be its own, and I want to say semi-autonomous state. Sort of like, I mean, I don't know, how can you be semi-autonomous? Like being sort of pregnant. I mean, you can't, right? But the idea is like, the idea is that Bulgaria is granted these forms of autonomy with the specific intent that Bulgarians will be able to manage themselves better, and the Bulgarian atrocities would not have happened if they were not under Turkish rule. So the logic of the national solution is also introduced in 1878, and that becomes very important. So it becomes a sort of touchstone, if you will, for how you deal with the question of oppressed minorities in the East. Well, it doesn't work. If it worked, I probably wouldn't be up here. We might be celebrating it as a sort of moment of, when the day oppression died, right? But what's important here is to think about what comes after this. So 1878 happens. In the 1880s, Britain and the United States are introduced to the Armenians and Assyrians and Greeks through a series of articles. I've tracked hundreds of articles about these minorities that appear in the press, in reviews, introducing the Britons to them. Oh, they're Orthodox Christians. They're kind of like us. They kind of look like us. They're a polite and commercial people. They're merchants. And this sort of rhetoric and this sort of introduce these minorities to the British public. It's sort of happening in the 80s. Well, in 1890s, when the pogroms start, or a series of massacres start in 1894 and 1895, between 1894 and 1896, under Sultan Abdul Hamid II in the Ottoman Empire, these massacres are read as a replaying of the Bulgarian story. And it sparks outrage on all levels of society. In some ways, folks think that this is a sort of replaying of the Bulgarian story. I don't really think it's a replaying of the story, but I think it's a way in which, a sort of natural way in which this rhetoric of humanitarianism, this rhetoric of oppression and opposition to oppressive forms of government that Britain is formulating, gets manifest in this controversy. So what happens? Well, in 1895, the Sultan whips up this anti-Armenian sentiment in a number of villages, and people start seeing them as the threat from within. The resentment of these Armenians as these merchants and farmers really reaches a fever pitch, and these massacres begin, and the Sultan does nothing. In fact, he is said to have encouraged a series of massacres, these sort of copycat massacres that happen all over eastern Anatolia. And these 1894, 95, 96 massacres, I mean, they happen for 3 years. Really very little is done to stop them, either by the West or from within Turkey. But they are the sort of these pogroms. And 100,000 people massacred in these 3 years is really understood as a very powerful number in Britain and the United States. And it sparks a tremendous response. In 1909, Turkey starts a sort of soul-searching. There's the Young Turk Revolution in 1909, which promises constitutional reform, a sort of replaying of the Tanzimat story in some ways. We want constitutional republic. Minorities, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians really see this as their moment. They say, if we get a constitutional reform in Turkey, we will be able to be guaranteed equal rights, and these massacres will stop. And they support it. And for a moment, there's a great honeymoon that happens in 1909, where you get the Turkish nationalists and the representatives of the minority groups, minority populations, really joining hands and saying, this is what Turkey needs. Well, that revolution quickly becomes hyper-nationalist and exclusionary. And the idea is the slogan that comes out of it is not equal rights for all, but rather Turkey for the Turks. The idea is that the constitutional reforms will benefit those who are truly part of the nation, who are truly Turkish. And it results in a series of massacres in Adana, or 25,000 Armenians are killed, sort of in the afterglow, if you will, of this failed constitutional reform. So we have a pattern of violence that happens. We have a pattern of responses that the West evokes and invokes, if you will, during this time. The genocide, when it happens in 1915, 6 years later, is really, I think, the culmination of a set of processes and responses that really can't be ignored. It didn't come out of nowhere. There's a series of oppressions that happen in the Ottoman Empire that happen over a course of period, and the West's response, I think, also is starting to become scripted. And when you get to the genocide moment, I think that what happens next should not be really surprising. So I'd like to talk about the events of the genocide. Do you have questions about the backstory? No? I've referenced nationalism, and I'm sure you've talked about it, but I think it's important to understand the sides in this story. Nationalism, we know that nationalism is a Western idea. It's how we get states in Europe, right? Germany and Italy are the great age of nationalism in the 1840s and 50s, 60s and 70s, I guess you could say. This idea that nations are bounded communities, where individuals share a common heritage, a common set of ideas, a common geography, is something that becomes a very powerful organizing force. The age of empire is clearly dying in the late 19th century, and what comes to replace it is this notion of nation. So the great empires, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, will all dissolve and will all be victims of World War I. But what comes out of that? Nation. And this idea, this nascent nationalism, comes out of the late 19th century and affects folks in the West as well as folks in the East. And there are Turkish nationalism, which is I think most embodied by Turkey for the Turks idea that comes out of the 1909 revolution. And there's also Armenian nationalism that comes out, where folks in Armenia are saying, or Armenians are saying, look, we need a homeland, right? We need a homeland like the Bulgarians have a homeland, so we're not victims of massacre, right? This Armenian nationalism, and I think Jay Winter deals with this quite nicely in your piece, is really seen as an overblown threat. First of all, as a minority population, Armenians cannot have guns. They cannot serve in the military. They cannot organize any sort of real resistance to the Ottoman government that could be an actual threat. In fact, the folks that are organizing, the best known Armenian nationalists, live in Russia and France. They're not folks that are actual subjects of the Ottoman Empire during this time. So it's an idea, it's an incredibly powerful idea, and it's one that affects multiple populations. What gets dangerous about nationalism is when it takes on its ethnic and religious overtones, as it does in Germany in the 1930s. The same thing really happens in Turkey in the 19-teens. It takes this ethnic religious overtone that makes those who are not part of the circle of we, shall we say, really worthy of not have no place in the nation, right? If you are not part of this group, if you're not in, you're out. And it makes the logic of genocide seem possible. So I think why genocide is understood as a 20th century crime is quite right. It is about the systematic extermination of a group. But the ideas that sort of lead to the logic of that action, they can really be rooted in a sort of hyper-nationalism that takes on this ethnic and religious tone that is exclusionary, to put it mildly, I guess. How do we get from massacre to genocide then, right? Because I've been using the word massacre to talk about Bulgaria, to talk about the pogroms of the 1890s, to talk about 1909. I have not used the word genocide. Well, how do we get there? Well, according to the 1948 UN Genocide Convention declaration, certain factors must be present to label an event genocide. Remember, crime of the 20th century. Primarily, it involves, quote, the mass sustained and indiscriminate killing of whole groups, right? So you can't just have a massacre that sort of explodes and then declines. It has to be a systematic, planned extermination of an entire group, genocide. Think about the origins of that word. The 1895 and 1909 massacres or pogroms were whipped up by the Sultan and dissident voices for those, as Jay Winter puts it, those not inoculated against hatred, as he puts it, and then sort of diminished, right? They